Ambassador Krell Tox of the Viridian Collective stared at the infant through the observation window, and for the first time in his 300-year diplomatic career, he wondered if he should have pursued meteorology instead. "They brought a baby," whispered Sector Coordinator Nimvix, her three eyes blinking in synchronized distress. "The Accord explicitly forbids apex predators from bringing offspring to high-stakes negotiations. The reasoning being obvious, of course. Apex predators protect their young with, well, aggression." Krell Tox adjusted his ceremonial robes. The human child, a girl according to the briefing materials, sat in a high chair, methodically destroying a biscuit with her tiny, devastating teeth. She couldn't have been more than 2 Earth years old. Her father, the human delegation's military liaison, stood nearby with an apologetic smile that could only be described as profoundly unsettling. "Commander Vace," Krell Tox began, selecting his words with the delicacy of a chef preparing a meal for beings with 17 different digestive systems. "The treaty clearly states that diplomatic missions must be conducted without the presence of juvenile apex specimens. We assumed this was, how do you say, mutually understood." The human, tall, scarred with the particular kind of alert stillness that only came from predators who had killed things, leaned back in his chair. His daughter, whom he called Lily, had somehow managed to coat her entire face with biscuit paste. "Yeah, about that," they said, his tone carrying the weight of someone about to cause an international incident, and not particularly caring. "My daughter is not a weapon. She's a child. There's no clause forbidding children, only apex species. So technically we're not in violation." The silence that followed could have powered a small star. Nimvix's secondary eyes bulged slightly. The Viridian delegation had never considered such a distinction. In their society, juvenile members of apex species were by definition future weapons. They were kept in separate facilities, trained from birth, monitored constantly. A Viridian child in a diplomatic setting was the equivalent of showing up with a nuclear warhead in a carriage. That humans treated their carnivorous offspring differently seemed incomprehensible. "The spirit of the Accord," Krell Tox attempted. "The spirit is nice," Lily interrupted. "Not interrupted exactly." She made a sound. A loud, high-pitched sound that human infants made when something wasn't going according to their preferences. Then she threw her half-eaten biscuit across the negotiation chamber. It hit Councillor Fexrin's shoulder. Fexrin, who had survived 3 wars and held 3 doctorate degrees in conflict resolution, flinched. The biscuit fell to the floor. Lily laughed. A proper laugh, surprising to those present, filled with genuine, unfiltered joy. Vace never moved, never apologized, never even glanced at his daughter. He simply continued the conversation, as though his spawn hadn't just committed what could loosely be interpreted as an act of food-based aggression. "The treaty says no apex species," he repeated, "on diplomatic missions. My daughter isn't here on a diplomatic mission. She's here because my childcare system fell through, and we couldn't reschedule this negotiation. Childcare is a documented problem in human societies. We're still working on solutions." Krell Tox had read extensively about human sociology. He knew their species spent approximately 1/4 of their lifespan helpless and dependent. He knew their infant mortality had only recently declined to acceptable levels. He knew they formed intense emotional bonds with their offspring that clouded their judgment and made them unpredictable. But knowing these facts intellectually and witnessing them firsthand were vastly different experiences. Lily squirmed in her high chair, somehow finding angles of escape that seemed to defy basic physics. Her father, still not moving, watched her with the kind of alert attention usually reserved for bomb technicians. "Your security protocols," Krell Tox said slowly, "allow for this?" "Security cleared her personally," Vace replied. He was looking at a tablet now, apparently reviewing something. His daughter was examining the restraints on the high chair with scientific intensity. "She's been scanned 14 times since we arrived. No weapons. No concealed devices. Just a 2-year-old. And if she becomes agitated..." This came from Nimvix, who had actually backed up her chair several inches. "Apex species display protective behaviors, When their young are threatened. We documented 17 incidents of human parental violence in preparation for these talks. Then I'll give her a snack, Vace said with the confidence of someone who had clearly never considered that his species' protective instincts might be the problem in a negotiation chamber full of 6 different alien species. She's generally pretty chill when she has food. Lily chose that exact moment to discover her ability to make clicking sounds against her teeth. She did this repeatedly, very loudly. Counselor Fexerin, who had been serving as the Viridian lead, actually stood up. Perhaps we should reconvene when environmental conditions are more suitable for— She's fine, Vace said. Not aggressively, not defensively, just factually, as though his daughter's ability to produce auditory disruptions was simply a neutral fact of the universe. Kids do this. It passes, usually within 10 minutes. The clicking continued. Kreltox found himself doing something he hadn't done in nearly 2 centuries, adapting his expectations in real time. The Accord had been written with the assumption that apex predators operated on certain predictable principles: survival of the species, protection of resources, elimination of threats. The young of apex species were logically extensions of this threat matrix, except apparently humans work differently. Humans, it seemed, brought their young to negotiations because of childcare logistics. They didn't weaponize them, they didn't use them as leverage, they simply included them, as though tiny, unpredictable apex predators were furniture. Commander Vace, Kreltox said, trying a new approach, what exactly is the purpose of bringing your juvenile offspring to a treaty negotiation? Vace finally looked up from his tablet. Honest answer? My ex-wife has her on weekends. This fell on my custody rotation. I can't just not show up to a meeting that took 6 months to arrange. So here we are. The simplicity of this reasoning should have been insulting. It should have been insulting. Instead, it was somehow both completely nonsensical and utterly pragmatic in a way that made Kreltox's head ache. Lily had stopped clicking. She was now engaged in the process of taking off her shoe, a small padded human foot covering with the determination of a demolitions expert. Her father noticed this but made no move to stop her. He seemed to be waiting for something. What followed was unexpected. The shoe, freed from her foot, was placed directly into her mouth. She sucked on it thoughtfully, apparently finding it to be a legitimate nutrition source. Vace pulled out a small cloth from his pocket, wiped something off her face, and then returned to his tablet. The territorial disputes, he said, as though his daughter wasn't currently chewing on manufactured polymer in the Meridian sector. Our position remains unchanged from the preliminary meetings. The human colonies were established with proper territorial permits. The expansion claims from your commercial interests require compensation according to existing law, not this newly retroactive reinterpretation you're proposing. Kreltox blinked all 3 of his eyes. The negotiations had continued. The human had pivoted directly back into formal discussion, while his offspring engaged in decidedly non-formal behavior. The dichotomy was creating actual cognitive dissonance. Your offspring continues to consume footwear, Nimvex pointed out. Yeah, she does that, Vace acknowledged. He retrieved the shoe from Lily's mouth, an action that prompted another laugh, that same surprising sound of pure, unadulterated joy, and handed her something else. A pink, rubber object, vaguely spherical. She began working on this new object with renewed enthusiasm. Teething phase. She's cutting her molars. It's annoying, but temporary. So about those compensation rates you mentioned. The meeting proceeded. It was extraordinarily strange, negotiating with an apex predator, who occasionally paused to attend to the needs of a smaller apex predator. Vace would make a point, Lily would shriek. He would provide her with a different distraction, and he would continue his point. No frustration, no deviation from his negotiating position. No apparent recognition that this situation was anomalous in any meaningful way. During the lunch reposition, a standard break in high-level diplomatic negotiations, Kreltox found himself alone with Commander Vace in the private conference annex. Why? Kreltox asked, not bothering with diplomatic phrasing. Why subject yourself to this complication? Vace was watching Lily color on a tablet, her small fingers producing bright, chaotic lines across the screen. She was humming, another sound, somehow both melodic and wildly imprecise. "Because she's my kid," Vace replied, "and I don't get many days with her. I'm not going to sacrifice those just because negotiations are important. Negotiations are always important, right? But I only get her every other weekend. The universe will keep spinning if I'm a little distracted, as long as I do the job." "This is counterintuitive to apex predator behavior," Kreltox observed. "Sacrificing efficiency for emotional attachment." "Sure," Vace said. He handed Lily a different stylus when she got bored with the first. She immediately went back to her chaotic art. "But it's also why we've survived as long as we have. Humans don't just think about the present, we think about the future. We think about what we're building for the next generation. My daughter gets to exist in a universe where her father isn't willing to throw away what matters to him just for politics. That's the point." Lily made a sound, more melodic humming, and looked up at her father. Vace smiled at her. She smiled back. In that moment, for just an instant, the predator vanished. There was only a father and his daughter, engaged in the simple act of existing together. Kreltox felt something unfamiliar, not understanding exactly, but perhaps the beginning of a realization that apex species, at least these particular apex species, operated according to rules that transcended simple territorial instinct and survival algorithms. When the negotiations resumed, Lily had fallen asleep in her chair, her coloring tablet still in her lap. Biscuit gently adjusted her position, covering her with a small blanket. And then, with his daughter sleeping nearby, Commander Vace dismantled every major point the Viridian Collective had prepared. He did it efficiently, methodically, with the precision of someone who knew exactly where every boundary lay and exactly how to navigate them. The territorial compensation was accepted with a minor modification. The commercial licensing agreements were revised. The resource-sharing protocols were established. By the time the primary negotiations concluded, the Viridian Collective had achieved exactly what they'd hoped for in the preliminary projections, but no more and no less. The human delegation had met them at neutral ground, except they'd done it with a toddler napping in the corner. As the day's session ended and delegations prepared to depart, Nimbex approached Kreltox with visible confusion still radiating from her bioluminescent surface. "They brought a child to a high-stakes treaty negotiation," she said quietly, "and somehow won the same outcomes we would have achieved against a traditional human diplomatic team." "Perhaps," Kreltox mused, "that is exactly why they brought the child." Lily woke then, stretching with the unself-conscious flexibility of something that hadn't yet learned why humans usually couldn't contort quite that way. She rubbed her eyes, looked at her father, and made that same laughing sound. Vace picked her up, settling her on his hip with the practiced ease of long familiarity. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, directing the question at Kreltox. "Yes," Kreltox replied. "Same time tomorrow." As they left the negotiation chamber, Lily waved at the assembled aliens, all 7 species represented, with the absolute certainty of someone who had no concept of fear or difference or threat. She waved at them as though they were friends. And in that moment, Kreltox realized something that the treaty writers had never truly considered. The most dangerous negotiators weren't the ones carrying weapons or advanced degrees. They were the ones willing to bring their entire reason for existence into the room and ask you to work around it. They were the humans, and they had just introduced the galaxy to an entirely new negotiating tactic. Vex whispered from beside him. "Should we be concerned about this development?" "Terrified," Kreltox replied. "Absolutely terrified." Outside the negotiation chamber, Commander Vace carried his daughter toward the human quarters. Lily fell asleep against his shoulder before they'd made it 20 meters. Tomorrow she would probably throw more biscuits. She would make sounds that defied description. She would occasionally consume inedible items. And somehow, against every strategic prediction and operational manual written in the last 1,000 years, the human delegation would continue exactly as they had today. Because that was what apex predators did, it seemed. They brought their young, and the galaxy would simply have to adapt. The second day of negotiations began with what could only be described as chaos, though the humans seemed entirely unbothered by it. Lily had discovered the water fountain in the delegation's private lounge. "She's just exploring," Commander Vace explained, watching his daughter systematically pour water from the fountain into a decorative plant, then attempt to retrieve it. "This is normal development. She's testing cause and effect." Councillor Fexrin stared at the increasingly waterlogged plant. The expensive, decorative plant, the one that had been imported from a horticultural exhibit, specifically chosen to represent peaceful coexistence between species. "The plant is drowning," Fexrin observed. "Plants are pretty resilient," Vace replied. "She'll get bored in a minute." Fexrin had survived 3 wars. He had negotiated the treaty that ended the Krell insurrection. He had delivered speeches that moved entire civilizations to reconsider their fundamental philosophies, and yet he found himself completely unable to formulate a response to the concept of intentionally allowing an apex predator to damage institutional property as part of a learning process. Lily did, in fact, get bored. Approximately 4 minutes later, she had moved on to a new obsession: the diplomatic seals on the walls. Specifically, she wanted to touch every single one, repeatedly, with what appeared to be no particular purpose beyond exploration. "Security is concerned," Nimvex reported, hovering near Krelltox with visible agitation. "The seals contain biometric locks. Her repeated contact is creating anomalies in the sensor readings." "Is she disarming them?" Krelltox asked. "No, she is simply touching them, with what appears to be toddler enthusiasm and no strategic objective." "Then it is not a security concern," Krelltox decided. "It is merely an inconvenience." Which was how the Viridian Collective learned quite thoroughly the difference between a threat and an annoyance. The distinction would become increasingly important as the day progressed. The formal negotiations resumed in the primary chamber at the designated hour. Lily was secured in her high chair. She had apparently accepted this arrangement as inevitable, with what Vace called appropriate snacking provisions, which meant a bowl of dried fruit, a container of something soft and vaguely nutritious, and a rubber object designed specifically for chewing. Protocol dictated that the Viridian Collective present their counter-proposals first. Councillor Fexrin had spent the previous evening carefully crafting revisions to their territorial agreements, incorporating new data that had arrived from their commercial partners. Halfway through his presentation, Lily sneezed. Not a small, polite sneeze. A full-bodied, whole organism sneeze that resulted in the immediate launch of something wet across the negotiation table. Fexrin froze mid-sentence. Vace pulled out the cloth that apparently existed perpetually in his pockets and wiped his daughter's face. "Sorry about that. Allergies? Probably. The environmental systems here are different from what she's used to. Your offspring is biologically unstable," Nimvex inquired with alarm. "She's fine," Vace assured them. "Kids get sniffly. It passes." The presentation resumed. Fexrin continued his proposal about resource allocation in the Western Mineral Territories. The Viridian Collective had significant commercial interests there, and they had prepared extensive documentation supporting their claim to expanded extraction privileges. 20 minutes into the presentation, Lily decided she was done with the rubber object. She threw it. It landed directly in the center of the holographic display Fexrin had been using to illustrate territorial boundaries. The display flickered. The carefully rendered three-dimensional map shattered into cascading data fragments. 3 months of preparation visualized and destroyed by projectile toddler. "Apologize," Vace said to his daughter. Not asked. Said it with the particular tone of someone establishing a boundary. Lily, miraculously, seemed to understand this was a moment of significance. She made a sound that vaguely approximated "sorry," though the pronunciation was creative and the sincerity questionable. Fexrin stared at the destroyed display. "I will reconstruct the visuals," he said quietly. He did not sound happy. What followed was extraordinary. As Fexrin worked to rebuild his presentation, Vace paid absolutely no attention to the catastrophic failure that had just occurred. He pulled out a different tablet, this one displaying what appeared to be children's programming, colorful shapes moving around accompanied by melodic sounds that made Kreltox's sensory organs hurt. Lily watched this with intense concentration, the force of her attention apparently sufficient to keep her stationary for several consecutive minutes. "Your species employs media as behavioral management," Nemvex whispered to Kreltox. "Is this not a form of chemical alteration?" "It is media," Kreltox replied. "Apparently quite effective media." The presentation resumed. Fexrin had managed to reconstruct the display, though not with quite the same precision or detail as the original. His tone had developed a particular quality, the sound of someone who had accepted that today would not go according to plan and had decided to proceed with diminished expectations. The Viridian proposals were substantial. They included expanded extraction privileges, extended tenure on the mineral-rich territories, and favorable taxation agreements. They were not unreasonable proposals. They were in fact quite reasonable, given the commercial investment the Viridian Collective had already made in those territories. Vace listened carefully. His daughter watched her screen. The data flowed between them like water, professional and measured and entirely straightforward. When Fexrin finished, Vace nodded thoughtfully. "Your mineral extraction claims are well documented," he said. "Your historical investment is legitimate. Your commercial partnerships justify expansion. However," he paused. Lily had made a sound, not a scream but something close to it. Something expressing frustration at something on her screen. Vace reached over and adjusted her tablet. The sound stopped immediately. "However," he continued without missing a beat, "your proposals don't account for the human settlements that have existed in those territories for the past 73 years. Those settlements have established legitimate claims under the Harmony Accords of. You're essentially asking us to validate your expansion while simultaneously asking the humans already living there to relocate." "They can relocate," Fexrin said flatly. "Humans are adaptable. This is well documented." "Yeah, we are adaptable," Vace agreed. "And also stubborn. And also possessed of a cultural aversion to being told to leave homes we've built. So here's what I'm proposing instead." What followed was a complex series of counter-proposals that Kreltox could only describe as devastatingly elegant. Vace had essentially taken the Viridian Collective's entire proposal, identified the central flaw, the assumption that human settlements could be treated as movable problems rather than established facts, and restructured the entire agreement around that fundamental reality. His new proposal maintained most of the commercial benefits the Viridian Collective sought. It expanded extraction privileges in specific territories. It established favorable taxation agreements, but it did so while preserving the human settlements, integrating them into the resource extraction framework rather than removing them from it. It was, Kreltox realized, not a counter-proposal at all. It was a comprehensive reorganization of the entire negotiating position, restructured to account for facts that the Viridian Collective had apparently forgotten existed. "This is acceptable," Fexrin said after reviewing the proposal. He sounded almost surprised by this conclusion. "This addresses our commercial needs, while maintaining stability in the affected territories." "Great," Vace said. "Then we're aligned on resource allocation." Moving on to manufacturing protocols, Lily had abandoned her tablet. She was apparently engaging in a new activity, making clicking sounds with her tongue against the roof of her mouth, while watching her father intently, as though studying a particularly interesting specimen. The negotiations proceeded through the afternoon, territory by territory, agreement by agreement. The human delegation, represented by a man who was simultaneously attending to his offspring and dismantling every objection the Viridian Collective could formulate, moved systematically through the prepared agenda. By the time the day's session concluded, they had established protocols that would have taken conventional negotiations weeks to develop. That evening, Kreltox found himself in an observation chamber with Nimvex, reviewing the day's recordings. "He is not distracted by the child," Nimvex observed. "He is more focused, more efficient. Every proposal he makes has been thoroughly considered. Every counter-argument he presents is precisely targeted. It is as though the presence of his offspring somehow enhances his negotiating capacity." "Perhaps," Kreltox suggested carefully, It provides him with clarity regarding priorities. When you are responsible for someone entirely dependent on you, perhaps your sense of what matters becomes simplified. The negotiations become less about abstract positioning and more about establishing frameworks that actually function for the people involved. That is a disturbing way to structure diplomacy, Nimbeck said. Yes, Krell-Tox agreed. It is. Day 3 began with what Vace called a slight fever, which apparently meant Lily was somewhat less enthusiastic about exploration and spent significant periods engaged in what might have been sleep or might have been what humans called watching screens. Vace seemed unbothered by this development, and medical scans revealed nothing catastrophic, merely the usual biological processes of a young human organism dealing with localized inflammation. With Lily in a state of reduced activity, the negotiations accelerated dramatically. Manufacturing protocols were established, shipping agreements were finalized, technology sharing frameworks were negotiated. The human delegation had apparently been waiting for the opportunity to work without frequent interruptions, and they had prepared comprehensively for this possibility. By midday they had moved through nearly 40% of the remaining agenda items. This is unsustainable, Fexerin declared, apparently concerned that they were actually going to achieve a comprehensive agreement through efficient negotiation. We require additional time for consultation on these manufacturing protocols. The implications are significant. How much time? Vace asked. 2 days. Perhaps 3. Okay, Vace said. We can work with that. Take what you need. We'll reconvene on the 4th day for final synthesis. The break was welcome, though Krell-Tox suspected it was more beneficial to the Viridian Collective than to the humans. The human delegation seemed entirely comfortable with the pace at which they were proceeding. That evening, Krell-Tox made a decision that violated approximately 4 different diplomatic protocols. He requested a private audience with Commander Vace. They met in the secondary observation chamber, away from official negotiating spaces. Lily was asleep in a portable containment unit, a small bed designed specifically for traveling human offspring. She made small sounds occasionally, apparent manifestations of whatever dreams occurred in the minds of tiny apex predators. Why are you really here? Krell-Tox asked directly, not the childcare logistics explanation. The real reason. Vace leaned back in his chair, studying the sleeping form of his daughter for a long moment before responding. Because humanity has spent the last 200 years being told we're not evolved enough, he said quietly. We're too emotional, too irrational, too driven by instinct. Every treaty negotiation, every formal contact with species that got their civilization figured out earlier than we did. We're always playing catch-up. We're always defending our presence at the negotiating table. He paused. Lily shifted in her sleep, one small hand extending beyond the boundary of her containment unit. So I brought her, Vace continued, not as a weapon, not as leverage, but as a statement. This is why we're here. This is what we're building for. Not territorial expansion or commercial advantage, though those matter too, but futures, stability, frameworks that work for people who haven't even been born yet. And if I have to be a little distracted, if I have to wipe snot and manage snacking schedules while I'm dismantling your negotiating positions, then that's fine, because the message is clear. We're not here to play the same games you've been playing for 10,000 years. We're here to build something different. Krell-Tox processed this statement through all 3 of his primary cognitive processors. It was simultaneously profound and ridiculous, strategic and emotional, completely alien to everything the Viridian Collective understood about diplomatic engagement. That is, remarkably honest, Krell-Tox said finally. Yeah, well, humans are capable of honesty when we're not terrified, Vace replied. And I'm not terrified. I'm just tired. Tired of the pretense. Tired of acting like emotions are a weakness rather than a strength. Tired of diplomatic games where everyone's pretending they don't have fundamental objectives. And your daughter? Krell-Tox asked, gesturing toward the sleeping child. What does she represent in this framework? That we're willing to bring everything to the table, Vace said. The whole of what we are, not our best diplomatic face, not our most carefully prepared arguments. Our actual selves, our actual values, and somehow that seems to make negotiations work better. When the negotiations resumed on the fourth day, Lily had recovered from her fever. She was back to full exploratory mode, which meant she had discovered the diplomatic courier system's interface and was very interested in pressing buttons. Nothing catastrophic occurred. She didn't launch any interstellar communications or declare war on a neighboring system. She simply pressed buttons with no understanding of what they did, occasionally making sounds of satisfaction when the interface responded to her input. Vace retrieved her from the interface after approximately 90 seconds, but not before she had quite inadvertently reorganized the entire communication queue system. The system is actually more efficient now, the communications specialist reported, reviewing the new arrangements. I'm not entirely certain what changes were implemented, but the new queue organization has reduced processing time by approximately 12%. Vace looked at his daughter with an expression of mock seriousness. Lily, are you trying to automate my job away? Lily made a clicking sound and reached for his fingers, which he apparently found as fascinating as any diplomatic interface. The final day of negotiations proceeded with a combination of formal agreement and casual atmosphere that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. The Viridian Collective and human delegation worked through the remaining agenda items, not in the traditional adversarial framework, but in a collaborative process that Kreltox could only describe as efficient. By the time the treaties were prepared for formal signature, they had established a comprehensive framework that addressed not just immediate territorial and commercial concerns, but long-term structures for ongoing communication and conflict resolution. The documents were extensive, comprehensive, detailed beyond what either delegation had initially anticipated. And somehow they had been negotiated while an apex predator spent significant time consuming snacks, throwing objects and making sounds that served no strategic purpose whatsoever. When the moment came for formal signature, Vace held Lily up to the ceremonial platform. He guided her small hand, still developing, still learning fine motor control, toward the signature panel. She pressed her tiny hand against it, leaving a handprint in the ceremonial ink. Her mark on the agreement, Vace explained to Fexerin's visible confusion. A reminder that this treaty isn't just for the current generation, it's for the future, for people who don't exist yet, for the world my daughter will inherit. Fexerin examined the small handprint. It was imprecise, imperfect, entirely lacking in formal diplomatic gravitas. This is acceptable, he said finally, though highly unconventional. Most good things are, Vace replied. As the delegation prepared to depart, Nimvix approached Kreltox one final time. We did not achieve everything we anticipated, she observed. No, Kreltox agreed. We achieved something different, something more stable, something more likely to function across multiple generations and changing circumstances. Is this a victory? Nimvix asked. Kreltox watched as Vace carried his daughter through the diplomatic corridors. Lily was reaching out toward the alien species they passed, making sounds of what might have been greeting or curiosity, or simply the random vocalizations of a young organism experiencing a strange new world. I believe, Kreltox said carefully, it is something better than victory. It is sustained humility. It is a framework designed not to win today, but to function tomorrow. And if that requires bringing your offspring to diplomatic negotiations, perhaps the rest of the galaxy should be taking notes. Lily waved at Kreltox as they passed. She still had no concept of threat, no understanding of the careful balance of power that underlay everything they had negotiated. She simply existed with the uncomplicated certainty of something that had never learned to doubt its own right to occupy space in the universe. When they had gone, Fexerin approached Kreltox with a question. Shall we implement this treaty immediately, or should we wait to determine the long-term implications? Implement it immediately, Kreltox decided. The humans are teaching us something. I do not fully understand what it is yet, but I recognize it as valuable. We should not resist it. We should observe it, study it. Perhaps, eventually, learn from it. And the child? Nimvix asked. What will the Viridian Collective report about the child? Kreltox considered this carefully. Then he made a decision that would become one of the most significant policy shifts in Viridian history. We report, he said slowly, that the humans brought their daughter to the negotiations because they are simultaneously apex predators and builders of futures. Because they do not view their emotional investments as weaknesses, but as clarifying forces. Because they were willing to bring their entire selves to the table, including the parts that seemed least prepared for formal diplomacy. And we report that this approach, despite all of our initial predictions, resulted in a superior agreement. He paused, watching the empty corridor where Vace and Lily had been. And we report, he continued, that perhaps the greatest strength of the human species is not their intellect or their tactical capacity. It is their willingness to love something so completely that it reshapes their entire approach to the world, even when that something is a small creature that destroys plants and throws biscuits at counselors. Nimvex's bioluminescence flickered with what might have been agreement. This is a concerning revelation, she noted. Yes, Krelitox agreed, but also a hopeful one. If humanity achieves that kind of success because of their capacity for love rather than despite it, then perhaps the galaxy has more potential for stability than we had anticipated. Weeks later, when the treaty had been formally implemented, and all the complex machinery of interstellar agreement had been set in motion, Krelitox received a transmission from the human diplomatic office. It was a brief message, accompanied by a visual file. The message read, "Ambassador Krelitox, Lily wanted you to have a copy of her artwork. She speaks very fondly of your people, Commander Vace." The visual file contained a crude drawing. Stick figures identifiable as aliens based on creative embellishment, and stick figures that were presumably human. They appeared to be standing together, possibly celebrating. The colors were chaotic and imprecise. Across the bottom, in handwriting that was barely legible, was a single word, friends. Krelitox processed this image through all three of his cognitive processors and experienced something he had previously considered impossible for his species in a diplomatic context. He found it touching, which meant, he realized, that something fundamental had shifted, not just in the treaties or the agreements, or the careful frameworks they had constructed, but in the nature of diplomatic engagement itself. The humans had brought their child to the negotiating table, and somehow in doing so they had changed everything. Not because of strategy or calculation, not because of weapons or leverage, but because they had brought love. And in a galaxy that had forgotten such things matter, that simple act of bringing something beloved into a formal space had somehow become the most revolutionary diplomatic tactic anyone had ever employed. In her small quarters, Lily was already drawing again. She had no understanding of treaties or territorial agreements or the complex implications of interstellar commerce. She simply drew what she felt: connection, friendship, the curious sensation of meeting someone new and deciding they were interesting. Her father watched her work, occasionally adjusting her grip on the stylus, offering guidance without constraint. And somewhere across the vast distances of space, Ambassador Krelitox of the Viridian Collective held a crude child's drawing and considered the implications of a universe where love had become diplomacy. It was, he decided, not the worst outcome he could have anticipated. It was, in fact, quite remarkable.